This summer, many of the scriptures for Sundays focused on Old Testament stories of the family of Abraham, and we haven't used them all in worship, but here's some of the long saga. There were 12 sons, as you might remember, born to the one known as Israel. The 11th son, Joseph, was an involuntary immigrant, shall we say, to Egypt, brought there away from his home by slavers. He grew up in a new land, but God was with him, and he rose from a precarious position as an immigrant slave, as a matter of fact, to become the second in command, only to Pharaoh, often acting on Pharaoh's part. Because of Joseph's foresight, shall we say, his adopted land of Egypt was rescued from drought. As the story goes, then, those who lived in Canaan and other surrounding countries, that is, his family, migrated to Egypt to get food, and they had some to share. So among those who came were Joseph's brothers, the very ones who had sold him into slavery. Joseph forgave them their treachery, however, all that they had done toward him in his youth, with some poignant moments of forgiveness and reconciliation in the story. It was a beautiful reconciliation. He asked them all to migrate to Egypt, to the land of Goshen, where he could care for their needs during this famine, and they could stay. And so all of them and their families, their father too, crossed the borders into a new land of opportunity. Back then, there was no need for passports and visas and work permits. They came and they settled in an area which was rich in land and opportunity, and they prospered. But we do know how it goes with immigrants, don't we? They look and act and dress and speak. Immigrants have a different, confusing religion than other populations very often. These immigrants certainly did. A few generations go by, and the climate between the races is strained. Immigrant families are despised because of their differences, because of their God, their ownership of land, and their prosperities. They are ambitious and they work hard, especially as the pharaohs come and go. The regime changes several times through the generations, and we find that difference becomes dislike and blame, which then becomes hatred. And hatred becomes oppression. And with oppression, the immigrants have been denigrated to the status of slaves, who take on all the menial, back-breaking jobs of the nation that nobody else wants to do. And eventually, they're doing hard labor as slaves of the empire, building monuments to the kings of Egypt, making brick, carrying heavy loads. But their very numbers become threatening. What if they were to rise up? The Egyptians were saying. A cruel pharaoh, who now remembers nothing of the brother Joseph, comes to power. The immigrant slaves are becoming so many that he's afraid of an uprising in which they might outnumber his soldiers and his taskmasters. The pharaoh commands the midwives to deliver dead babies from the Israelite immigrant women, or to throw them into the river. You might remember this story from last week if you were here. In the midst of that genocidal oppression comes two brave midwives and a brave mother and a sister of a tiny infant. The midwives say the babies are born too soon and they can't make it to the birthing in time. An unnamed mother and her daughter Miriam save her tiny baby, do as the pharaoh commanded, throwing him into the river in a waterproof basket. There he is discovered by a princess from Pharaoh's very own household and taken to be raised by her. His name is Moses. Raised with all the privilege of the Egyptian royalty, but with contact with his birth mother, who was hired to nurse him. Moses gets the best of both worlds. As a young man, he sees an Egyptian taskmaster brutally beating a Hebrew slave, and he cannot control his anger. He strikes out and ends up taking the life of the Egyptian. Moses is so shaken by his own behavior that he runs away, makes a life for himself in the desert, marries, and he tends sheep. A nice, quiet life. It is the vast amount of time that he has for meditation. The time comes when he's watching sheep. He encounters a brightly burning bush and the voice of God calling him to go back to Egypt and save his people. Now, if you have been to a Passover dinner, you've heard some of what takes place. You know that Moses resisted, but God persisted. And you know that Pharaoh resisted letting the slaves go, but Moses persisted. You've heard that there were 10 plagues upon the land of Egypt, and in each one, worse than the one before, Pharaoh says that they should they should all leave Egypt, and then he waffles and says, no, you have to stay. The Passover celebrates the coming of the final plague. The first 9 were bad, but they could be explained away. The Israelites are told to put lamb's blood on their doorpost, which they do. And at midnight, the angel of death passes over their homes, but the Egyptian homes was all the firstborn of their household. And even the firstborn of their cattle and their sheep and their other animals, and even the Pharaoh's firstborn son is not spared. Finally, in his grief, tells them to get out. He's finished with them. Leave Egypt. And the next day, the Israelite people quickly pack up their belongings and flee in great numbers. Their neighbors, too, want them to go so badly that they give them gold and silver and other valuables to get rid of those people, so no more harm will be done by their God to on Egyptian soil. This is what the Passover celebrates for the Israelites. It's their freedom. They're free to go and to leave their lives without bondage and oppression. They can live without fear of being caught doing something outside their social status, for instance, coming and going as they need to take care of their own needs. No curfews or fear of arrest for minor infractions or for being out of bounds. Their labors will now be labors that benefit themselves and their families, not their oppressors. They own property. It's theirs, which they have worked for. They do not have to answer to someone who has their life in his hands, only to themselves, to their God. And when they're tired, when they're sick, when they're injured, they can rest and they can heal, not forced to work it. They have the responsibility to feed themselves, choose their own path, to take their own risks outside the restrictions of racial privilege and integration. They are free, completely free. In that freedom, they flee the clutches of their former home, the place where they have been treated so very cruelly, and they find themselves approaching the Red Sea at the same time that they realize that there are chariots and soldiers pursuing them. The Pharaoh has once again had a change of heart, a hardening of the heart, the Bible says. The cloud and the pillar of fire that represents their God goes then between them and the pursuing army. Before this cloud of fire had been in front of them, what goes behind them, cutting off Egypt's forces. And Moses stretches out his rod to part the waters, and they walk across the vast sea on dry land. Afterwards, the soldiers follow, and their chariot wheels are bogged down in the mud. The waters return, and they were thrown into confusion and drowning. The Israelites are saved. They are saved. They are safely across the water with the water between them and their former taskmasters. They are on their own. They are journey ahead. There will be trials along the way. They'll have to make a home somehow. For now, they have unleavened bread dough to bake, and some animals and some water. They can make a life of their own, and this they celebrate. Jesus said, I come that you might have life, and that abundantly. This is the feeling of freedom. This is what God wants for each one of every generation, for every race, for every place on the earth. The right to work and eat and play and have life to its fullest. You and I are a part of that dream. Jesus never promised that we should have life without any problems. He didn't say that we'd be wealthy or unencumbered by trying times. He didn't promise his followers an easy route to prosperity. He didn't promise perfect health and an easy life. He said, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. In other words, you'll have to do some work, but it won't be too much for you to bear. God's promise to Moses was that he would not be alone, guided by God. And again, the promise that Jesus gave us is that we are not in this life alone. Where two or three are gathered in community, freedom, and in love, he is there. Our bondage to masks and to distancing 6 feet away, and worry and heartbreak will come to an end. Our bondage to leaders who care more for themselves and their power and wealth will come to an end. We are here for one another. In Christ, our liberator, is with us. Native or immigrant, young or old, rich or poor, many colors and sizes. We who join together in mutual support find that God is among us, setting us all free to live abundant lives. This is a promise for you and for me. I come to give you life and that abundantly. You will live in freedom. Praise be to God. Amen.